right, guys, welcome to another episode of The Life of Jesus. Today, our text will be John chapter 7, verses 11 through 52. But this is going to be part one. We're going to break up this section in several parts. And so today, we're specifically going to look at verses 11 through 24. And Jesus has finally made it to Jerusalem. Remember, he's on this secret journey. People aren't aware of where he is or what he's doing. And he gets to Jerusalem, okay? And so we are at the Feast of Tabernacles. So let's jump right in. John chapter 7 and verse 11. The text tells us the Jews. Now remember, when we see the word the Jews here, this is the same word for Judea. We're talking about the Judeans, and this is probably referring to the authorities. And the reason why I say that is because most oftentimes it is. But then even within this text, there is a distinction that seems to be made between the leaders and the common people. If you drop down to verse 25 of this text, it says that some of the people of Jerusalem, notice how it says that some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, is this not the man whom they, speaking of the authorities, are seeking to kill? Okay, they were a distinction between the authorities and just the people within the crowds, okay? And so the text again says the Jews. So we're talking about the Judean authorities. And then John goes on to say that they were looking for him. Literally, they kept on seeking for him. They're watching out for him. They're looking for him to appear. They're waiting, they're anticipating, they're expecting it to happen, okay? This is on their minds, on the forefront of their thoughts. They are waiting for him to show up. So they're waiting for him to show up at the feast, and they're saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering. We're talking about like a slight rumbling right under the surface, or just maybe right on top of the surface. And so there's this muttering about him, that is Jesus, among the people. So Jesus got people talking, right? It's like a mixture of hope and tension. It's a slight movement under the water before the waves actually come. While some said, he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Now, so there's some mixed reviews, if you will, right? There's some mixed opinions. There's a couple of different perspectives here. So remember this, it's the Feast of Tabernacles, and there's a mixture of people from different areas. At the very least, we know that some of these people are from Galilee, and obviously some are from Jerusalem. And so they're going to have different perspectives. It only makes sense that there will be some in Jerusalem that are heavily influenced by the Judean authorities who are against Jesus. And then you have those from Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his time. We're talking about people who were directly impacted by what Jesus was doing. Maybe they just simply witnessed what he was doing. Maybe they themselves were healed. Maybe they were the beneficiaries of the ministry of Jesus directly. Maybe it was a family member. Maybe it was a close acquaintance, whatever it is. These are people who are going to have a different perspective and a different opinion, because they are from that specific area where Jesus spent most of his time. And so you at the very least have those two different groups among the crowd, okay? And then John goes on to say, yet for the fear of the Jews, again, Judean authorities here, no one spoke openly of him. And so you have these differences of opinions, right? These differences of perspectives, yet it's still just murmuring right under the surface, or maybe just slightly on top of the surface. There's there's some movement under the waves, under the water, okay, before the waves come. So it seems regardless of their opinion of Jesus, people kept it on the down low because they didn't want to get involved. So why didn't they want to get involved? Well, because of the Judean authorities. Okay, these are people that, regardless of their perspective of who Jesus is, regardless of where they're from, they understand the power. They understand the authority that the leaders possess and what could happen. Okay, and they don't want to fall on the wrong side of the fence here. And so it's just best to not have anything to do with it. Leave it alone. They didn't want to get involved regardless of how they personally felt about what was going on. That's the general gist of what's happening here. That's the That's the aura within the air here. And then John says in verse 14, so it's about the middle of the feast. So we're talking maybe third, fourth, or even the fifth day. Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. So he kept his whereabouts a secret for at least half the feast, and now Jesus is right before their eyes. Let's see how they respond. Let's see what they do. The Jews, verse 15, the Jews, again, think Judean authorities, therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? So after all the hype and the intentions of the Judean authorities and these plots, they're waiting for him to show up. This is how they respond. Jesus is there teaching without interruption, and they are in wonder of his skill and ability. The question is, why? Well, he had not attended any rabbinical schools in Jerusalem. He hadn't not been educated in the formal way. He didn't go through the typical ranks and the way in which rabbis would be brought up and would have the permission and the authority to teach. He wasn't a rabbi in the traditional technical sense, if you will. And he was able to use their own methods, though, better than they could. And so Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. In other words, it didn't originate with me, nor is it the product of any traditional methods. And then Jesus makes a bold and dangerous claim that his teaching and its source is superior in every way to what they would typically look to. He says in verse 17, if anyone's will is to do God's will. When you see the word will, think desire. In other words, if your intent is to align your desires with God's desires, align your will with God's will. So Jesus says, if anyone's desire, if anyone's will is to do God's will, to align themselves with God, he will then know. This word know here is I love this word because it has to do with understanding through firsthand knowledge. We're talking about experimental knowledge, okay? We're talking about an understanding that one comes to because they've taken some information and they've lived it out, they practice it, they have been in real situations, and now they have a better and deeper understanding of what that means, okay, and what that actually looks like. And so it's now we know. So Jesus says, if anyone has a desire to line themselves up with their desires, their wills with God's desire, with God's will, they will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority, Jesus says, seeks his own glory. Glory, literally the glow which is his own. We're talking about the honor. Remember, they functioned under an honor-shame society. And so the one who speaks on his own authority, which is typically what some rabbis did, and then they would have disciples, right? The students that would become people who could carry on their own tradition, their teaching. And so they would go forth speaking in the name of their rabbi. That's why you had various rabbinical schools of thoughts. And so the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, his own honor. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. And in him there is no falsehood. And obviously, Jesus is speaking of himself. And some of your translations might say in him there is no unrighteousness or injustice. In other words, the one who's done this has done nothing wrong, and you won't be able to show that he had done anything wrong. So again, Jesus is speaking of himself. So the question is, why? Why will you not be able to show that he has done anything wrong? Well, because he is not seeking his own honor, but the honor of the one who sent him. And so if Jesus was seeking his own honor, they wouldn't be in wonder. He would be doing things like they would do them, like they would expect rabbis to function. But yet Jesus says, I'm here not seeking my own, but the one who sent me. Now we also understand that when Jesus says that, he's talking about the Father, he's talking about God. Over and over and over again, especially in John's gospel, Jesus uses this terminology, he who has sent me. And so Jesus is essentially saying that what you see me doing, I'm not seeking my own honor. I'm seeking the honor and the glory of the one who sent me. That's why you see things differently. In fact, the source of my teaching and the one who sent me is superior to the sources of your teachings or the teachings that you would look to or where you think the sources of these teachings would come from. It's far superior. This is why you don't see things the way you would maybe traditionally see them. And then he goes on to say this, and this is where it really starts to get interesting. In verse 19, has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. So why do you seek to kill me? Now, to understand what's going on here, you really have to go through this text, but let me just kind of give you a heads up. You need to see what's going on here. It's the classic challenge and riposte where there is this public back and forth banter and someone is going to walk away with honor and the other was going to leave in shame. And so what Jesus does here is he introduces where he is about to take the conversation by bringing up the law of Moses and a specific instance where it is not kept. And in doing so, it really makes them no different than Jesus. Like they're coming after Jesus. They have a certain perspective of Jesus, the Judean authorities, for this particular reason. But yet, it's just a mirror. If they would simply see and look and have, I would suggest, pure motives, they would see that what they are angry about concerning Jesus, they themselves do it as well. And so it's not just simply about Jesus doing something or breaking some law. There's something deeper going on. There's something deeper going on there. And so he says in verse 20, John, so the crowd, after Jesus says this, the crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? So obviously, right, there are people within this crowd that aren't aware of some of the entrapping, some of the things that are happening, the plots, right? But they say you have a demon who is seeking to kill you. Now, it's important to note this as well, that it was common to assume that when someone was sick, it was because they had a demon or they were possessed by some divinity. There's something supernatural going on there. See, they didn't understand the science behind sickness, and they didn't even understand how they themselves contributed to that. And the only way that they could relate to their own contribution to something or someone else's contribution to something was to think that it was because of some sin that this has been done. This was judgment from God, okay? They didn't understand the science behind sickness. And this right here, and them trying to explain, trying to understand what was going on behind all of this. This was the obvious explanation for them. It's got to be a demon. It's not something we can pinpoint. It's not something we can put our finger on. And so it sounds like they're saying that Jesus is sick. So, well then, what is it? Well, they're basically saying you're hallucinating. You must have a demon because no one is here trying to kill you. Now, verse 25, you have some who actually say, hey, isn't this the man that they're trying to kill? And so what's going on here? Well, remember, I think maybe those in this crowd that said this either were a part of those people who were unaware of this plot to kill Jesus, or these were people who were aware of the plot but didn't realize that this is the man the plot is against. Because remember, Jesus had spent a whole lot of time in Jerusalem, and a lot of people probably just heard about Jesus and may not have actually seen him with their own eyes. And so what they're seeing unfold was a very common thing that would happen within the temple between teaching and educating people, right? This is something that was a commonplace. You see Jesus engage in this when he was a young child. And so this setting here is not unusual, but in this setting here, you do have different people from different places and who have different perspectives and opinions of what's going on here. So that's important to remember, regardless of what's happening and who's saying what and what people will understand or know, right? These crowds are filled with all sorts of different people who have different perspectives, and the various responses in this text alone illustrate that very thing. However, with Jesus' response, he brings things out into the open. He faces the tension head on. Remember previously, in previous texts, we talked about Jesus is turning his face towards Jerusalem. Now he is focused. There is something very specific that he is headed towards, and now he is engaging that very thing. And so with this, he faces the tension head on. Look at verse 21. Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Now, I don't believe Jesus is talking about the fact that his teaching, what they were marveling at in his abilities and his skills. He's focused on something else here, right? He's already mentioned the fact that, listen, why are you trying to kill me? So he's bringing to surface this plot, okay? And so what he's saying now is in relation to that plot. So obviously, Jesus had to be talking about something that happened in Jerusalem. And this takes us back to John chapter 5. During the time of another feast that was taking place, Jesus is there and he heals this paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. But the problem was it was on the Sabbath. And after he heals this guy, he tells this guy to take up his pallet, roll it up, and walk and leave. And that's what this guy does. He rolls up his pallet and he starts walking away. But then the Judean authorities stop him because he's carrying his pallet on the Sabbath. And then the man tells him, look, all I know is that the man who healed me, he told me to do this. So then they ask him, well, who was it? Who was it? Who did this? And he doesn't know. But then a little bit later on, Jesus finds the man in the temple. And then the man turns around and tells the authorities that it was Jesus who had healed him. And it was after this that the text tells us that the authorities started to plot against Jesus because he was doing things like this on the Sabbath. Look at verse 22 and how Jesus responds. Jesus says, Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. In other words, circumcision is older than Moses, right? It was around before Moses. And he says, listen, you keep it. And in order to keep it, you, at least according to your own interpretations, would have to admit that you violate the Sabbath. So in other words, you're willing to drop the Sabbath rule for circumcision. Like, it's that important to you, right? And if on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry? And the word here, angry, is interesting because it's a word that describes that feeling of contempt when you see someone doing something you don't like. It's not a raging mad feeling, but more like a disgust, a melancholy mad or disdain. So Jesus says, you're angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well. So you are willing to set aside one part of the law for this one act that affects one part of the body. But you're not willing to set aside this one part of the law for this one act that affects the whole person. So let me get this straight. You're willing to acknowledge that there are greater reasons, greater purposes that supersede the Sabbath law, and you don't think this is one of those reasons? Like, I am doing exactly what you're doing. We are both addressing the needs of a person on the Sabbath. And then Jesus says in verse 24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. So this takes us back to verse 17, where Jesus said, if it is your desire to align your will with the will of God, you will come to know through firsthand experiences whether what I am doing is from God. So here's your opportunity. Take what I have laid out before you and see for yourself. This is something you do. What's the difference? And besides that, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath itself was designed to address the needs people had, right? The need for rest. And that comes from the very heart, the desire or will of God for them. And if a person's desire to align their wills with God, if a person desires that, they would see this. And then I would suggest they might also begin to see how either circumcising or healing someone on the Sabbath is akin to the intent of the Sabbath itself. They're all addressing a need. These sorts of texts make me think about how if we're not careful, we might do the same thing to others around us. We might also use scripture to justify our own contempt for people or our looking down on people. That's the big problem with religion. That's the big problem with Christianity, as the big problem with the church as it is used in its modern sense of these words today. That's the big issue that people have with Christians, with the church, with quote unquote religion and how it's defined today. People, this is what they see. This is what they experience. Or maybe they themselves were this way and they just got disgusted by themselves and walked away. But this is, regardless, a big issue. It's a big problem. And we have to be careful because we could be the kind of people who don't really follow the standard by which we judge and condemn other people ourselves. Which, by the way, we shouldn't be in the business doing either one of those. But nevertheless, there's a certain standard we hold people to or we judge or condemn people by, and we don't even necessarily hold ourselves to the same. That's a problem. But it's been my experience, or should I say my understanding, which has come from firsthand knowledge, that when we do this, we most often, when we do this, our issue really isn't with someone else, but with ourselves. So we have a tendency to project or to try and make ourselves feel better about ourselves by making someone else look bad, or maybe just keeping our attention on other people. And at least that keeps our focus off of ourselves. And it makes us feel better. And this isn't just a Christian problem. It's a human problem. But as followers of Jesus, we can do things differently. In fact, we're called to do things differently. We can be different and show the world a different way of being human. If we first look inside, we work to become more self-aware. And as we work to become more self-aware, we can actually work to put off the old self. And as Paul said, be renewed in the spirit of our minds and put on the new self, which is created, right, in the likeness of God, in righteousness and holiness of the truth, which is a poetic way of saying becoming Christ-like. Grace and peace. We'll talk to you soon.